On a crisp autumn morning, the streets of London buzzed with life. The air carried a slight chill, and the golden leaves danced in the breeze as tourists and locals moved through the city. Buckingham Palace stood proudly at the heart of it all, its grandeur drawing people from every corner of the world. Among the crowd was James Calloway, a 78-year-old man whose presence seemed to carry a quiet weight. His steps were slow but deliberate, his cane tapping softly against the pavement with each movement. His coat bore rows of medals, glinting faintly in the sunlight, silent witnesses to the years he had spent serving his country. James hadn't planned this visit. For decades, he had avoided places like this, finding it hard to face the memories they stirred. But today felt different. Perhaps it was the way the sun lit up the palace grounds, or the cheerful chatter of families around him. Or maybe it was something deeper, a longing to reconnect with a part of himself he had locked away long ago. Whatever it was, James found himself walking toward the changing of the guard ceremony, a tradition steeped in history that he hadn't seen since his youth. As he neared the gates of Buckingham Palace, the sound of marching feet echoed in the distance. The rhythmic beat of drums, mixed with the crisp notes of brass instruments, filled the air. People gathered eagerly, jostling for a better view. Children climbed onto their parents' shoulders, cameras clicked incessantly, and laughter rippled through the crowd. Yet James stood apart, his gaze fixed on the scene unfolding before him. The guards marched in perfect formation, their scarlet uniforms vivid against the gray stone of the palace. Their bearskin hats added an almost regal touch, making them look larger than life. To most, they were symbols of tradition and discipline. But to James, they represented something more personal. Each step they took reminded him of his own days in uniform, the camaraderie, the sacrifices, and the pain. He could almost hear the distant echoes of gunfire and feel the weight of the rifle he once carried. A lump formed in his throat as memories washed over him. Faces of friends flashed in his mind, men and women who had stood by his side only to never return home. Some had been young, barely out of their teens, full of dreams they would never live to see realized. Others had been seasoned soldiers, their humor and resilience keeping morale alive even in the darkest moments. James clenched his cane tightly, his knuckles white, as he fought to steady himself. He wasn't sure why he had come here today. Maybe it was to pay tribute to those who couldn't be there. Maybe it was to remind himself that his service hadn't been forgotten, even if it sometimes felt that way. Whatever the reason, standing there among strangers, he felt a strange sense of belonging. The ceremony wasn't just a display of pageantry. It was a celebration of duty, honor, and sacrifice, values he had lived by for so many years. As the guards took their positions, James's eyes landed on one particular soldier. Tall and imposing, the young man stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable behind the rigid mask of protocol. There was something about him that caught James's attention. Maybe it was the way he held himself, with pride, but also with a hint of vulnerability beneath the surface. Or maybe it was the realization that, despite the years between them, they shared a bond forged by service to their country. Without thinking, James stopped in his tracks. His hand instinctively rose to his forehead in a salute, one that was slow, deliberate, and filled with emotion. It wasn't just a gesture of respect. It was a bridge across time, connecting two generations bound by duty and sacrifice. By the time James reached his small apartment later that evening, news of the day's events had already begun to spread like wildfire. Sarah, the journalist who had spoken with him outside Buckingham Palace, had posted a heartfelt article online within hours, complete with photos and video clips of the poignant moment between James and the young guard. Social media platforms lit up almost instantly, with users sharing the story far and wide. Hashtags like #RespectForHeroes and #BridgingGenerations trended across the country, drawing attention not just from locals but from people around the world. The footage captured everything. The way James stood tall despite his frailty, the quiet determination in his salute, and the unexpected yet deeply moving response from the Royal Guard. Viewers were struck by how such a simple act of mutual respect could convey so much emotion. Comments poured in by the thousands. Some expressed gratitude for veterans like James, while others praised the Guard for breaking protocol to honor him. "This is what humanity looks like," one commenter wrote. Another added, "It's moments like these that remind us we're all connected." Local news channels picked up the story, airing segments during their evening broadcasts. Anchors spoke passionately about the encounter, framing it as a powerful reminder of the sacrifices made by those who served and the importance of acknowledging them. One anchor, visibly moved, said, "In a world that often feels divided, this moment shows us what can happen when we choose kindness over rules, connection over convention." Clips of the ceremony replayed on screens nationwide, each viewing bringing new waves of emotion. James, however, remained unaware of the storm his actions had ignited. He sat in his armchair, staring at the framed photographs on his wall, pictures of comrades long gone, frozen in time with smiles that masked the hardships they endured. His mind replayed the day's events over and over again. The sound of boots marching in unison, the weight of his own salute, and the young Guard's unexpected response. It was surreal to think that something so personal had resonated with so many people. The next morning, as he shuffled into the kitchen to make tea, James noticed a blinking light on his answering machine, a relic from an era before smartphones became ubiquitous. Pressing play, he listened to a series of messages, each more surprising than the last. The first was from Sarah, thanking him for allowing her to share his story and inviting him to participate in a follow-up interview. The second came from a veterans organization, asking if James would be willing to speak at an upcoming event honoring service members. By the third message, James realized the scope of what had happened. Strangers were calling to thank him, not just for his service decades ago, but for reminding them of the enduring value of respect and gratitude. Meanwhile, the young Guard found himself at the center of attention as well. His commanding officer requested a private meeting to discuss the incident. To his relief, there was no reprimand, only praise for representing the values of compassion and honor that the Royal Guards were meant to embody. "You've done something extraordinary," the officer told him. "Not every soldier has the courage to step outside tradition the way you did." Encouraged by the positive response, the Guard decided to reach out to James. Through Sarah, he arranged a meeting, hoping to express his gratitude in person. When they finally met again, this time away from the bustling crowds of Buckingham Palace, the two men exchanged stories. The Guard revealed that his grandfather had fought alongside soldiers like James during the Falklands War. He always said the real heroes were the ones who came home carrying scars no one could see. The Guard explained. His voice-filled meets James again, revealing a deeper connection through his grandfather's service. Public reaction grows, emphasizing unity and gratitude. Story sparks national reflection on duty and sacrifice. End scene with emotional weight and anticipation for next steps. James's salute hung in the air, a quiet yet powerful gesture that seemed to freeze time around him. The young Royal Guard standing before him was trained to remain stoic, unyielding, and unmoved by anything or anyone. Yet, as James's trembling hand rose to his forehead, something inside the Guard shifted. He couldn't explain it. A mix of instinct, respect, and an overwhelming sense of connection, but he felt compelled to respond. The crowd around them was oblivious at first. Cameras clicked, children giggled, and the distant hum of conversation continued uninterrupted. But then, the unthinkable happened. The Guard hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough to break the rigid rhythm of protocol, and slowly lowered his rifle. His gloved hand moved upward in a crisp, deliberate salute. It wasn't flashy or overly dramatic. It was simple, yet it carried a weight that rippled through the air like a stone dropped into still water. For James, the moment was surreal. His heart swelled with emotion as he realized what had just occurred. Here was a young man, bound by centuries-old traditions, choosing to step outside those boundaries to acknowledge him. It wasn't just about the medals pinned to his coat or the years he'd spent serving his country. It was about being seen. For so long, James had felt invisible, like his sacrifices were relics of a forgotten past. But now, standing face to face with this guard, he felt valued, respected, and understood. The guard's eyes met James's briefly, though his expression remained composed. Behind the polished facade of duty, there was a flicker of humanity, a shared understanding that transcended age, rank, and time. James's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he simply nodded, his weathered face softening into a gentle smile. The guard responded in kind, his posture relaxing ever so slightly, breaking the illusion of invincibility that came with the uniform. The entire exchange lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. To James, it was as though the world had paused, leaving only him and the guard in a bubble of mutual respect. The noise of the crowd faded into the background, replaced by the steady beat of his own heart. He thought about all the men and women who had stood where he stood now, those who had worn uniforms, carried burdens, and made sacrifices for causes greater than themselves. And he thought about the young soldier before him, carrying that same torch into the future. What made this moment even more poignant was its rarity. The Royal Guards were known for their unwavering discipline, their ability to stand motionless for hours without flinching. They were living statues, symbols of tradition and order. Breaking protocol was not just uncommon, it was practically unheard of. Yet here was this young man, choosing to prioritize human connection over rules. It was a decision that spoke volumes about his character and the values instilled in him during his training. As the guard resumed his position, James took a step back, his chest rising and falling with deep, uneven breaths. Tears welled up in his eyes, blurring his vision, but he didn't bother wiping them away. This wasn't a moment of weakness, it was one of profound gratitude. He had come to the ceremony seeking closure, perhaps even a reminder of his place in the world. What he found instead was validation, a reassurance that his service mattered, that it had left a mark on the generations that followed. The crowd, which had been largely unaware of the silent exchange, began to notice the shift in energy. A hush fell over the spectators closest to James and the guard. Some craned their necks to see what had caused the pause in the usual routine, while others whispered among themselves, trying to piece together what they had witnessed. One woman gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized the significance of the moment. Another man turned to his companion and said, "Did you see that? That doesn't happen every day." And he was right. Moments like these were rare, not because they couldn't happen, but because they required a willingness to set aside convention and embrace humanity. As James stood there, his cap still clutched in his hand, he knew he would never forget this day. Neither, it seemed, would the young guard, or the growing number of onlookers who had begun to realize they were witnessing something extraordinary. The ripple effect of the salute began almost immediately. As the young guard resumed his position, rigid and immovable once again, whispers started to spread like wildfire through the crowd. At first, it was just a few people closest to James who noticed the unusual exchange. A mother holding her child's hand leaned over to her husband and murmured, "Did you see that?" The guard actually moved. Her voice carried just enough for those nearby to hear, sparking curiosity among the onlookers. Within moments, heads turned, cameras pivoted, and phones were raised high to capture what had happened. Some in the crowd replayed videos they had taken, zooming in on the brief interaction between James and the guard. Others strained their necks to get a better view, pointing excitedly as they pieced together the significance of the moment. One teenage boy nudged his friend and said, "That never happens. I read online that these guys are supposed to act like statues." His friend nodded, wide-eyed, replying, "Yeah, but this is different." The atmosphere shifted subtly yet unmistakably. What had begun as a routine ceremony now felt charged with emotion. People who had come merely to snap photos or check an item off their tourist bucket list found themselves drawn into something far more meaningful. Strangers exchanged glances, smiles, and quiet comments, united by the shared experience of witnessing something rare and beautiful. A middle-aged woman standing near James wiped a tear from her cheek as she watched him slowly put his cap back on. She stepped forward cautiously, her voice trembling as she said, "Thank you, sir, for your service." Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound, cutting through the hum of chatter around them. James looked at her, startled for a moment, before offering a small, grateful smile. "You're welcome," he replied softly, his voice barely audible over the growing buzz of the crowd. Others followed suit, emboldened by the woman's gesture. An older man approached James, extending his hand. "I served too," he said, his grip firm despite the tremor in his fingers. "It's good to see someone honoring us like this." James shook his hand warmly, nodding as if to say he understood completely. More people joined in, some offering thanks, others simply expressing admiration through hugs, pats on the back, or kind words. For James, it was overwhelming but deeply moving. He hadn't expected any of this when he decided to attend the ceremony that morning. Meanwhile, the young guard remained steadfast in his post, his face betraying no emotion. But inside, he felt a surge of pride and a hint of nervousness. He knew he had broken protocol, however briefly, and wondered how his superiors might react. Still, he couldn't bring himself to regret his actions. Something about James's salute had struck a chord deep within him, stirring memories of stories his grandfather used to tell about his own days in the military. Those tales of sacrifice and brotherhood had shaped the guard's understanding of duty, and seeing James reminded him why he chose this path in the first place. As the ceremony continued, the energy of the crowd remained electric. Even those who didn't fully grasp what had transpired could sense the gravity of the moment. Parents knelt beside their children, explaining the importance of respecting veterans and acknowledging their contributions. "This is what bravery looks like," one father told his daughter, gesturing toward James. "And that's what honor looks like," he added, pointing to the guard. The little girl nodded solemnly, clutching her stuffed animal tightly as she absorbed the lesson. By the time the changing of the guard concluded, the scene outside Buckingham Palace was unlike anything anyone present had ever experienced. The usual polite applause that accompanied the end of the ceremony was replaced by heartfelt cheers and sustained clapping. Some people lingered, reluctant to leave, while others gathered around James, eager to hear his story. Though he was modest and humble, James couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. For years, he had doubted whether his sacrifices were remembered or appreciated. Now, surrounded by strangers turned friends, he realized that his service had not been forgotten. It had simply been waiting for a moment like this to shine brightly once again. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the palace grounds, it became clear that this day would be etched in the memories of everyone who witnessed it, not just for the spectacle, but for the humanity that made it unforgettable. The impact of James and Thomas's story continued to grow in ways neither of them could have anticipated. What began as a single, heartfelt moment outside Buckingham Palace had now blossomed into a nationwide movement, sparking conversations about gratitude, service, and the importance of honoring those who dedicate their lives to protecting others. Schools, community centers, and even corporations began reaching out, eager to incorporate the lessons of that day into their own spaces. One of the first initiatives came from a group of teachers inspired by the event. They launched a program called Bridging Generations, which paired students with local veterans for storytelling sessions. The idea was simple yet profound. Give young people the opportunity to hear firsthand accounts of courage, sacrifice, and resilience directly from those who lived them. Veterans like James visited classrooms, sharing not just stories of war, but also reflections on camaraderie, leadership, and finding purpose after returning home. In one session, a high school student named Emily asked James, "Were you ever scared?" He chuckled softly before answering, "Every single day." But fear isn't something to run from. It's something to face. And when you're standing beside people you care about, it becomes easier to keep moving forward. His answer left a lasting impression on the students, many of whom wrote essays or created art projects inspired by his words. Meanwhile, Thomas played an active role in bringing attention to the modern-day realities of military and ceremonial service. He participated in panel discussions at universities, explaining the rigorous training required to become a Royal Guard and addressing misconceptions about what the role entailed. "People think we're just standing there looking pretty," he joked during one talk. "But every second of our shift is about discipline, focus, and representing something bigger than ourselves." His openness resonated deeply with audiences, particularly younger generations curious about careers in public service. Inspired by his actions, some students expressed interest in joining the armed forces or pursuing roles where they could contribute to their communities. One teenager told Thomas afterward, "You made me realize that serving doesn't mean losing yourself. It means finding a way to make a difference." Beyond education, memorials and monuments saw renewed interest as families visited them together, guided by a desire to learn more about history and honor those who served. At cenotaphs and war graves across the country, flowers piled up alongside handwritten notes expressing thanks. Many visitors cited James and Thomas's story as the reason they had come, saying it reminded them to pause and appreciate the sacrifices made by previous generations. Businesses also joined the wave of goodwill, organizing events to celebrate employees who were veterans or active duty members. Companies implemented programs offering mentorship opportunities between older veterans and younger workers, fostering connections similar to the one James and Thomas shared. These initiatives weren't just symbolic, they created real bonds, helping bridge gaps between age groups and backgrounds. Perhaps the most touching development was the flood of letters and messages James received from strangers around the world. Some wrote to thank him for inspiring them to reconnect with veteran relatives they hadn't spoken to in years. Others shared personal stories of loved ones who had served, expressing how his actions reignited their pride in family legacies. One letter stood out. A woman wrote about her late father, a soldier who rarely spoke of his time in combat. "Your story gave me closure I didn't know I needed," she said. "It helped me understand why he carried himself the way he did, with quiet strength and dignity." As weeks turned into months, invitations poured in for both James and Thomas to speak at events ranging from charity galas to international conferences. While they accepted some, they remained grounded, aware that their story wasn't about fame. It was about connection. Each appearance reinforced their belief in the power of humanity to transcend barriers, whether generational, cultural, or institutional. At one such event, James delivered a speech that encapsulated everything he'd learned since that fateful day. "We often think of heroes as larger-than-life figures," he said, his voice steady and clear. "But true heroism lies in the everyday choices we make, to show kindness, to listen, to remember." That young man beside me today reminded me that no act of respect is too small, and no gesture of gratitude goes unnoticed. By the end of his talk, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. As James stepped back, Thomas took the stage, adding his perspective. "Sir James taught me that tradition isn't about rigid rules, it's about values. If breaking protocol helps someone feel valued, then it's..." The ripple effects of James and Thomas's story continued to spread far beyond what either of them could have imagined. It wasn't just a fleeting moment captured on camera. It had become a catalyst for meaningful change, inspiring communities to come together in ways that transcended age, background, and experience. The bond between the elderly veteran and the young guard had ignited something profound, a renewed appreciation for service, sacrifice, and the ties that connect us all. One of the most visible outcomes was the establishment of an annual event called Unity Day, dedicated to celebrating those who served in any capacity, whether on the battlefield, in hospitals, or within their own neighborhoods. Cities across the UK began hosting parades, ceremonies, and community gatherings where veterans, active duty personnel, first responders, and civilians shared stories, meals, and laughter. Unity Day became more than just a tribute. It was a reminder that everyone has a role to play in building stronger, kinder societies. James and Thomas were invited to lead the inaugural Unity Day celebration in London, standing side by side as grand marshals of the parade. As they rode through the streets in an open-top car, waving to cheering crowds, James felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known in decades. Children ran alongside the vehicle, holding handmade signs that read, "Thank you," and "Heroes Forever." For Thomas, seeing the joy and gratitude on people's faces reinforced why he had chosen his path. "This is what it's all about," he whispered to James, who nodded with a smile. But the impact of their story didn't stop there. Schools adopted new curriculums focused on teaching students about the values of duty, honor, and empathy. Teachers incorporated lessons inspired by James and Thomas's encounter, encouraging kids to think critically about how they could contribute to their communities. One school even launched a pen pal program connecting students with veterans, allowing them to build relationships over time. Letters exchanged between eager children and wise elders often included drawings, poems, and heartfelt notes expressing admiration and gratitude. On a national level, policymakers took notice of the movement sparked by James and Thomas. Legislation was introduced to improve support systems for veterans, ensuring they had access to health care, housing, and mental health resources long after their service ended. Advocacy groups credited the widespread attention generated by the pair's story for pushing these issues into the spotlight. "If not for moments like this," one advocate said during a press conference, "we might never have seen such progress." For James personally, life took on a new vibrancy. He no longer spent his days alone in his apartment, surrounded by memories. Instead, he became a beloved figure in his community, regularly visiting schools, attending events, and mentoring younger veterans struggling to adjust to civilian life. His presence brought comfort and inspiration to many, proving that healing could happen when people chose to share their stories rather than keep them locked away. Thomas, too, found himself forever changed by the experience. Though he remained committed to his duties as a royal guard, he carried a deeper understanding of the humanity behind the uniform. On quiet shifts outside Buckingham Palace, he would occasionally spot visitors mimicking the salute James had given that day, a small but powerful gesture reminding him of the connection they had forged. It was a humbling reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could leave lasting impressions. As the years passed, James and Thomas stayed in close contact, meeting regularly to reflect on how their lives had intertwined. Their friendship grew stronger with each passing month, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. They often joked that fate must have brought them together for a reason. And neither doubted that reason was to remind the world of the importance of gratitude and unity. Looking back on everything that had unfolded, James once remarked to Thomas, "I thought my story ended when I came home from the war. But really, it was just beginning. Because every time someone says, 'Thank you,' every time a child asks me about my medals, or every time you stand tall in your uniform, you're keeping our legacy alive." Thomas smiled, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "And you're keeping mine alive, sir. You remind me why I do what I do. Together, we're part of something bigger than ourselves." Their journey, from a chance encounter outside Buckingham Palace to becoming symbols of hope and connection, proved that even the simplest gestures could create waves of change. What started as a salute became a movement, touching countless lives and leaving behind a legacy of compassion, respect, and unity. And though neither James, the meeting between James and the young guard took place in a quiet cafe tucked away on a cobblestone street near Buckingham Palace. The atmosphere was cozy, with soft jazz playing faintly in the background and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. For both men, it felt like a chance to step away from the whirlwind of attention they'd been caught up in and simply connect as human beings. As they sat across from each other at a small wooden table, the guard, whose name was Thomas, began to share more about his grandfather. "He used to tell me stories about the Falklands," Thomas said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "How cold it was, how hard the fighting got, but also how much he admired the men he served with. He always said you never truly understood what courage looked like until you saw someone keep going even when everything inside them wanted to stop. James listened intently, nodding slowly. He could picture those days vividly. The biting wind, the endless nights spent huddled in trenches, the camaraderie that kept morale alive despite the chaos. "Your grandfather sounds like a remarkable man," James replied, his tone warm but heavy with memory. "I wish I could have met him." Thomas smiled softly. "I think he would have liked you, sir. In fact, I know he would have. He taught me that serving isn't just about following orders. It's about protecting something bigger than yourself. And seeing you today, well, it reminded me why I chose this path." Their conversation flowed effortlessly after that, weaving together tales of past battles and present-day duties. James spoke of friends lost along the way, their laughter still echoing in his mind, despite the years that had passed. Thomas shared his own struggles, the pressure of living up to centuries-old traditions, the loneliness of standing motionless for hours while crowds stared, and the pride he felt knowing his role symbolized strength and stability for so many. What struck both men most was how similar their experiences were, even though decades separated their service. They realized that whether fighting on a battlefield or guarding a palace, the essence of duty remained unchanged. Sacrifice, resilience, and an unshakable commitment to something greater than oneself. Word of their reunion quickly spread, thanks in part to Sarah, who had accompanied James to document the moment. Her article about their meeting went viral almost immediately, capturing hearts around the globe. Readers were moved not just by the initial salute and its aftermath, but by the bond that had formed between two individuals from vastly different generations. One reader commented, "This is proof that no matter where or when we serve, we're all part of the same family." Inspired by the overwhelming response, local leaders decided to organize a special event to honor veterans and active duty personnel alike. Invitations were sent out, and soon James and Thomas found themselves sharing a stage at a packed auditorium. Veterans from various conflicts filled the front rows, their medals gleaming under the spotlight. Active soldiers, police officers, firefighters, and paramedics joined them, representing modern-day defenders of peace and safety. When it was their turn to speak, James stood first, gripping the podium with trembling hands. "I didn't expect any of this," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "For years, I thought my service was forgotten. But today, sitting here among all of you, I feel seen again. Thank you for reminding me that what we do matters, that we matter." The audience erupted into applause, some rising to their feet as tears streamed down their faces. Then it was Thomas's turn. Standing tall in his ceremonial uniform, he looked out at the sea of faces before speaking. "Sir James reminded me of something important," he said, turning briefly to nod at James. "That our job isn't just to protect, it's to connect. To show compassion, even when it means breaking protocol. Because at the end of the day, we're not statues or symbols. We're people, and if we can make someone feel valued, then we've done our duty." His words brought the house down, earning a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. As James and Thomas embraced afterward, the crowd chanted their names, united in gratitude and admiration. It was clear that this wasn't just a celebration of two individuals. It was a tribute to everyone who had ever worn a uniform, carried a burden, or sacrificed for the greater good. By the time the event ended, plans were already underway to expand its reach. Schools reached out, asking if veterans and guards could visit classrooms to teach students about history, service, and unity. Memorials saw increased visits, with flowers and notes left behind by those inspired to pay their respects. What had started as a single moment, the ceremony ended, but the energy in the air lingered like the final notes of a powerful symphony. As the guards marched away, their boots clicking against the pavement in perfect unison, the crowd began to disperse slowly, though many stayed behind, unwilling to let go of the moment they had just witnessed. James stood quietly amidst it all, his hands gripping his cane as he tried to process everything that had happened. He felt both exhausted and exhilarated, as if he'd been carrying a heavy weight for years only to have it lifted suddenly. A young journalist approached him cautiously, microphone in hand. "Sir, may I ask you a few questions?" she asked gently, her tone respectful. James hesitated for a moment before nodding. The woman introduced herself as Sarah and explained that she worked for a local news outlet. "What made you decide to come here today?" she asked, her curiosity evident but tempered with kindness. James took a deep breath, collecting his thoughts. "I'm not sure," he admitted, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. "Maybe it was time. I'd spent so many years, well, trying to forget some things. But today, I wanted to remember, to honor those who didn't make it back." His words hung in the air, raw and honest, resonating deeply with everyone listening. Sarah nodded, scribbling notes quickly. "And when the guard returned your salute, what did that mean to you?" she asked softly, her eyes meeting his. James paused, searching for the right way to express what he felt. Finally, he spoke. "It meant everything. It reminded me that we're still connected, even across generations, that our sacrifices aren't forgotten, and that there are people out there who understand what it means to serve." His answer brought murmurs of agreement from the small group that had gathered around them. One elderly man stepped forward, tears glistening in his eyes. "I was in Korea," he said, addressing no one in particular. "Lost friends I'll never stop missing. Seeing this today, it's like a balm for old wounds." Several others nodded, sharing similar sentiments. A bond formed among these strangers, united by shared experiences or a profound respect for those who had served. Meanwhile, the young guard who had broken protocol was making his way toward the edge of the palace grounds after completing his duties. Spotting James still surrounded by admirers, he hesitated briefly before approaching. Removing his bearskin hat, he extended his hand. "Sir," he said, his voice firm yet warm, "I wanted to thank you again for your service and for reminding me why I do what I do." James looked at the young man, surprise flickering across his face, before breaking into a wide smile. He shook the guard's hand firmly, his grip strong despite his age. "No, lad," James replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. You carry the torch now. Keep it burning bright." The sincerity in James's words struck a chord with everyone nearby. Applause broke out spontaneously, starting softly but growing louder as more people joined in. Some cheered, while others simply clapped respectfully, their faces reflecting admiration and gratitude. The guard, visibly moved, gave a slight bow before stepping back into formation with his fellow soldiers. As the crowd continued to buzz with excitement, stories began to emerge organically. A grandmother recounted how her late husband had served in World War II, describing the hardships he endured and the pride he carried until his last days. A young couple holding hands shared how they were inspired to learn more about military history after witnessing the day's events. Even children chimed in, asking questions about medals, uniforms, and what it meant to be brave. For James, hearing these conversations filled him with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. He realized that moments like this weren't just about honoring the past, they were also about inspiring the future. By sharing his story and connecting with others, he was helping ensure that the values of sacrifice, courage, and unity would live on. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of orange and pink, James turned to leave. The crowd parted respectfully, allowing him space but showering him with smiles and nods of appreciation. Sarah, the journalist, called after him. "We'll make sure your story is told, sir." James glanced over his shoulder, giving her a grateful nod before disappearing into the fading light. Though the day was coming to an end, its impact would stretch far beyond the confines of Buckingham Palace. For everyone present, it was a reminder that acts of kindness, respect, and humanity could transcend barriers. Whether they were generational, cultural, or institutional. And as James walked away, he couldn't help but feel that, for the first time in a long while, he truly belonged.